Case opened. Case file. Number 203. The ghost connection anomaly. The evidence is gathering in the quietest corners of modern life. A text message arrives from a close friend offering support during a difficult week. It is left unread. A phone vibrates on a desk, displaying the name of a family member. It is flipped face down. An invitation to an event is met with a carefully constructed excuse, or worse, total silence. When the human animal experiences physical trauma, its biological imperative is clear. Signal for help, seek the pack, find shelter. But when tracking psychological or emotional distress in the modern era, investigators are observing a stark, counterintuitive behavioral pattern. Individuals experiencing profound emotional overload are systematically cutting their communication lines. They are retreating into deep, dark isolation, deliberately vanishing from the social networks built to support them. The paradox is glaring. As a social species, human survival has depended entirely on community connection for over 200,000 years. Isolation is, biologically speaking, a high-stress state. Yet, when the modern mind is hurt, it rejects its own evolutionary remedy. The question isn't whether people are retreating. The question is, why does the brain treat its closest allies as active threats when it is at its most vulnerable? Phase 1. The crime scene. To understand the mechanics of this anomaly, investigators must first examine the environment where the disappearance occurs. It rarely looks like a dramatic exit. Instead, it is a slow, silent erosion of presence. Case notes from behavioral observations reveal a typical timeline, baseline functioning, to emotional stressor, to communication, slowdown to the ghost state. Initially, response times to messages stretch from minutes to hours, then days. Eventually, the subject enters the ghost state. They consume digital media passively, observing the world through a glass screen, but they stop interacting. They become ghosts in their own lives. If you ask the subjects, after the fact, why they withdrew, their witness reports are remarkably consistent. They offer variations of a simple explanation. I didn't want to be a burden, or I just didn't have the energy to explain. But behavioral science suggests these explanations are merely surface-level justifications. They are the stories the conscious mind tells itself to rationalize a deeply rooted, automated defense mechanism. If energy conservation were the true objective, maintaining a simple, passive connection would require far less cognitive effort than the active anxiety of ignoring people who care about you. Leaving a message unanswered creates a psychological debt, a lingering awareness of a task unfulfilled. It actually costs more mental bandwidth to isolate than to reply with a basic phrase. Therefore, the lack of energy hypothesis does not hold under close scrutiny. A hidden variable is operating beneath the surface. Phase 2. The suspect's investigators have isolated 3 primary suspects responsible for driving the ghost connection anomaly. Each suspect presents a compelling motive. Suspect A, the social tax. The first theory points toward the changing nature of human interaction. In the modern landscape, communication is rarely just communication. It is a performance. To respond to a friend requires managing expectations, matching emotional tones, and projecting a baseline level of stability. When an individual is in crisis, this social tax becomes an unbearable financial deficit for the psyche. Suspect B, the vulnerability, threat perception. The second suspect is deep-seated evolutionary programming. To show weakness to the tribe, historically carried an immense risk. If you were sick, injured, or emotionally compromised, you could be viewed as a liability, or worse, targeted by predators. The mind may be interpreting emotional distress as a physical vulnerability, triggering an ancient protocol to hide in a cave until the wounds heal. Suspect C, the autonomy fortress. The final suspect is a psychological countermeasure. When a person's internal world is chaotic and overwhelming, external inputs, even well-meaning ones, feel like an invasion. Severing connections is a blunt force tool used to freeze the environment, ensuring that no new variables can enter and further destabilize the system. Each suspect explains a piece of the puzzle. But the breakthrough occurred when investigators looked past what the subjects were running from and began analyzing what they were running toward. Phase 3. The evidence. To identify the true culprit, we must look at a landmark concept in behavioral psychology, the social baseline theory, pioneered by neuroscientist Dr. James Cone. In clinical studies utilizing functional MRI scanners, researchers monitored the brain's threat detection centers, specifically the amygdala, while subjects expected a mild electric shock. When the subjects were alone, their brains lit up with intense stress and threat management activity. When a stranger held their hand, the threat response diminished slightly. When a romantic partner held their hand, the threat response plummeted. The neural architecture of the human brain assumes access to other humans as a default state. The brain considers social proximity as low-energy expenditure because responsibilities, vigilance, and survival tasks are distributed across the group. Anomalous finding. If the brain naturally burns fewer resources when connected to others, then isolating during a crisis should cause the brain's internal stress monitors to spike violently, and indeed they do. So, why does the system override its own baseline optimization? Investigation notes reveal a crucial distinction in modern distress. The electric shock experiment involves an external threat. When the threat comes from the outside, the pack is a refuge. But the ghost connection anomaly occurs primarily when the threat is internal. Shame, burnout, feelings of inadequacy, or severe emotional fatigue. When the threat is internal, the presence of others undergoes a catastrophic shift in the brain's perception matrix. Instead of being viewed as resources to help share the load, other people are reclassified as auditors. Phase 4. The breakthrough. This is where the investigation takes its definitive turn. The primary driver of the ghost connection anomaly is not a lack of energy, nor is it a simple desire for privacy. The culprit is the threat of perceived appraisal. When an individual is drowning in emotional distress, their self-valuation drops to zero. They perceive themselves as fundamentally broken, unappealing, or failing. Because human brains are highly attuned to social status and belonging, the mind immediately projects its internal self-criticism onto the outside world. The logic of the anomaly operates as follows. Internal distress to self-evaluation. Drops to project appraisal onto others. To isolation to evade judgment. The brain concludes that if it allows loved ones to see it in this degraded state, those loved ones will inevitably judge, pity, or reject it. Pity is interpreted by the ego as a drop in social status. Judgment is interpreted as a precursor to exile. To prevent this imagined rejection, the brain executes a preemptive strike. It rejects the world before the world can reject it. By ghosting their connection network, the individual creates a psychological fortress. Inside this fortress, they are profoundly lonely and highly stressed, but they are safe from the one thing they fear more than suffering: the confirmation that they are a disappointment. This behavior is further compounded by the hyper-curated nature of modern society. Humans today observe thousands of highly optimized, successful versions of other lives daily. This creates an unspoken rule in the collective psyche. You must be good company to belong. When people lack the energy to present that optimized version of themselves, they assume their raw, unedited pain has no market value. They withdraw their product from the shelf entirely. Phase 5. Case closure. Case closed. The investigation into case number 203 reveals no broken machinery. The ghost connection anomaly is not a sign that a person has stopped caring about their relationships. It is evidence of a highly sophisticated, defensive misfiring of the human operating system. The mind, desperate to protect its remaining dignity, misidentifies love as judgment and connection as an exhausting performance. It retreats into the cave of isolation, unaware that it has locked itself inside with the very predator it was trying to escape. Its own unchecked thoughts. The tragedy of the anomaly is that the ghost state creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. The longer a subject remains isolated, the greater the shame of their absence grows. The debt of unanswered messages compounds daily, making the act of returning feel increasingly dangerous. Ultimately, the human mind remains uniquely vulnerable to this trap because it confuses the exhaustion of performing with the exhaustion of connecting. And as long as society treats vulnerability as an administrative error rather than a biological reality, humans will continue to vanish into the quiet spaces of their own lives, waiting for a version of themselves they deem worthy enough to return.